This is ADHD Self-Mastery. Customized solutions for your unique brain with Bonnie Mincu, Senior Certified ADHD Coach. If you have traits of ADD or ADHD, you may struggle with getting started on a task or planning a project. Maybe you're easily overwhelmed or perpetually late, miss deadlines, or can't get organized. Bonnie brings you concise, tangible strategies and solutions to help you break through these challenges and accomplish your goals. ADHD Self-Mastery starts now.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Mincu, Senior Certified ADHD Coach and founder of Thrive with ADD, and you're listening to ADHD Self-Mastery. If you're an adult with traits of ADD or ADHD, self-mastery is confidence that you're in charge of your own productivity or daily doings without being undermined by frustrating habits or tendencies. In this episode, I'll explore another aspect of overwhelm, the feeling that things are too much. I previously mentioned two broad ways people can feel overwhelmed. First, when there really is too much on your plate to handle. And with ADHD, you may take on too much voluntarily. Here, a sense of overwhelm can be a useful warning signal. And secondly, a whole area of overwhelm that's particularly common for people with ADHD that I call false overwhelm. That's when your brain fools you into thinking there's much more to do or to process than there really is. In the last episode, I looked at how trying to learn or process information in a modality that's weak for you will make you feel overwhelmed. And modalities refer to seeing, hearing, or touching or movement. To keep that kind of overwhelm at bay, become aware of how you crave or need to function. You might need a combination of modalities to process best. For example, listening to a lesson while you're walking, reading or taking notes on a topic while you're hearing it explained, or talking out loud as you think things through while you're writing. And studies have found that most people do better dealing with information that's printed out on a paper than on a screen. And that's whether it's taking notes or processing what you read. Now, let's talk about different ways that your mind may be tricking you into making you overwhelmed. And that's through the kind of assumptions you may have. Assumptions are things you believe are true that are so ingrained that you may not even consciously realize that they are assumptions. They're ideas or values that you take for granted. When you assume something, you don't question the belief, you simply act as if it is true. An assumption I hear from people a lot is that you're supposed to hold everything in your memory. Once I began coaching ADHD adults in 2001, I quickly realized that I was in some sense blessed by having a terrible memory. My memory's always been bad. I've never known what it would feel like to count on remembering someone's name or face that I've just met once. If anyone gives me verbal directions to get anywhere, I can't hold more than one step in my head. I don't remember birthdays, dates, or appointments. I have a hard time keeping in my mind everything I'm supposed to do for any day. And because I must assume that it's far more likely for me not to remember something than to remember it, writing things down is essential. And it's equally essential that they're written in a place I know I'll consistently look for it. That means I've always used a calendar for everything. I've always taken notes on every work-related meeting or phone call, and I file those notes in a labeled folder. If I have to remember a random thing to do the next day, it goes in my calendar or in some place where I'm sure to see the reminder. And that's why I say I was blessed with a poor memory, because I've had to use systems from a very early age. And those served me well in college and in a corporate career. And they're certainly essential now as an ADHD coach and trainer. The general assumption in a corporate environment is that people do take notes and use a calendar religiously. Written systems are expected. Coming from that world, I was shocked to hear people with ADHD say that they were ashamed of not being able to remember things, or that they considered a calendar to be a crutch. It still surprises me to hear ADHD coaching clients say that they're really very disorganized, but that they overcompensate with calendars and planners and reminder systems. It's almost like they're apologizing or feeling ashamed of using the systems. Why would anyone feel this way? I can only blame it on critical Calvin driving their brain inappropriately. In the first episode of this podcast, I introduced the metaphor of your brain as a bus with various characters riding aboard. Any of these riders could run up and grab the steering wheel at any time to drive the bus, often to your detriment. Critical Calvin is the character who evaluates, analyzes, and criticizes. And if he's a dominant driver on your bus, it would be him scolding that you should be able to remember things without writing them down anywhere. This is a false narrative. Calendars and organizing systems, whether they're paper or digital, are basic tools of life. They're not crutches or overcompensation devices intended for poorly functioning or disorganized people. Leaders and managers in organizations assume that everyone would require these kind of tools or systems to stay on track. If someone doesn't put things in their calendar or file their notes, that person would be considered disorganized. Now, I know a lot of people with ADHD struggle with figuring out what kind of system to use or how to develop a good process for entering information in a calendar or a system. And that's a lesson for another day. In fact, I have several lessons for how to develop or customize your own best system in my Productivity Pathfinder training. But the important thing to realize is that it's not ADHD or weak to need a system. As long as you hold everything in your memory and assume that it shows strength to do so, you're likely to be subject to overwhelm at some point. Now, here's a side note. You may have ADHD and have an excellent memory, but memory weakens with age. People who had always counted on their memory get very thrown off when it starts to be less reliable. And this is especially true for women because our estrogen begins dropping around age 35. I've had so many women come to ADHD coaching in their 40s, panicked because their ADHD symptoms seem to be becoming worse. That's the effect of diminishing hormones. We'll take a quick break here and resume with more assumptions that may be giving you a false sense of overwhelm.
Do your ADHD tendencies get in the way of you doing what you intend to? Traditional strategies for getting things done may not work for you. You need solutions tailored for your unique brain. In Bonnie Mincu's training membership program, Productivity Pathfinder, learn ADHD self-mastery step-by-step at your own pace in a supportive community with live online options each week. Learn more about Productivity Pathfinder at thrivewithadd.com.
Welcome back to ADHD Self-Mastery. I'm Bonnie Mincu, and we've been talking about ways your brain can give you a false sense of overwhelm due to misleading assumptions you might hold. One of those is the belief that you should hold all information in your memory instead of using tools and organizing systems. Another assumption I've found a lot of people with ADHD fall prey to is all or nothing thinking. It's the unconscious belief that until you can do all of a project at one time, you shouldn't start it. All or nothing thinking may hold you back when there's an area of your home that you want to organize or declutter. Here's an example that's come up a lot with ADHD coaching clients over the years. My client states the intention to declutter the basement over the weekend. Week after week, the weekend comes and goes with nothing started. As always, the best way to break through inaction is to uncover the roadblock by asking a series of why questions. Why was no progress made on the basement? Answer, because it seemed so overwhelming, I just couldn't get myself to start. What was overwhelming about it? I looked around the basement and there was so much to do. Why didn't you start on a small area? I felt defeated before even starting because there still would be so much left. Why not just concentrate on the small area as the task to complete that day? Now, here is where the all or nothing assumption arises, and you can imagine it coming from critical Calvin, paralyzing you with the assumption that you can't feel satisfied or proud of something you've done when there's still a lot left to do. With critical Calvin driving your brain, you assume the only way to declutter the basement is to do the whole basement at once. That would require you performing some kind of marathon. Of course, the thought of this could be overwhelming, and spending your entire precious weekend on it is likely to be depressing. This all or nothing thinking is almost guaranteed to defeat you and keep that project from getting started. The reason I mention it as a false sense of overwhelm is that you're telling yourself it's necessary to do an overwhelming amount of work, when in fact, any human being can only work on one task or area at a time. And even people that are multitasking are really flitting from task to task. The most efficient way to declutter your basement is to focus on just one aspect or area of it at a time. Once you complete that, you may move on to another area, perhaps on a later day. When you confine your focus to the specific task at hand, it's not overwhelming. When breaking down a project, it's important to make sure that each task in that project isn't overwhelming in itself. For every step or stage of the project, consider the actions that need to be performed to complete the step. And it's best to think this through in writing or by creating a visual that you can refer to. Mind mapping is a great tool for this. I teach my ADHD friendly version of mind mapping on paper in my Productivity Pathfinder membership training program. So far, we've looked at two assumptions that can contribute to people feeling overwhelmed. Those were all or nothing thinking and believing you're supposed to remember everything. One more insidious assumption is perfectionism, the belief that perfection is the only acceptable state. Everything you do must be a perfect 10. It's either perfect or it's terrible. Perfectionism is a tendency that I encounter a lot in ADHD people, although it certainly isn't present in everyone with ADHD. In fact, one of the more common stereotypes about ADHD sounds like the opposite of perfectionism, the tendency to skip over details or to be sloppy or disorganized. Some perfective fiddling happens as a result of falling into hyper-focus on the details of a project. You could get all caught up in perfecting the format of a document and spend so much time on it that there's not enough time for writing the substance. And suddenly you panic and realize how little time is left before deadline and how much there is to do, and overwhelm hits. Those kinds of situations probably aren't so much about a perfectionism assumption as simple ADHD hyperfocus. The best remedy for that is to set a timer before you begin formatting or fiddling to make sure you limit the time you spend on it. However, if you're prone to perfectionist thinking that's causing real problems in your time management, you may have overtones of OCD or anxiety disorder, and those are both common co-occurring conditions with ADHD. So often we get those added gifts. If this is the case, you may agonize over making things perfect in the assumption that nothing else is tolerable. You don't know when to stop or to allow that something is good enough. If you apply perfectionism to everything you do, this tendency is going to make things take a lot longer than they need to. You spend too many hours on work, likely in some state of tension or anxiety, with not enough time to relax. Some overwhelm is probably inevitable. And this again is critical Calvin warning you that everything has to be perfect. He may even remind you of negative results in the past when perfection wasn't achieved. And if you tend to be slapdash or forgetful of details, this warning could be helpful. But for people with perfectionist tendencies, hearing Calvin's voice in your head all the time is more likely to make you anxious and overwhelmed. Reliance on memory, all or nothing thinking, and perfectionism, three tendencies stemming from assumptions that can lead you to a state of overwhelm. If you realize you hold these beliefs, be on guard against them. In the next episode, learn how you may think you're overwhelmed when it's really a very different roadblock that's causing you paralysis. This is Bonnie Mincu of Thrive with ADD. For a step-by-step system for ADHD self-mastery, check out my training-based membership program, Productivity Pathfinder, at productivitypathfinder.com. And subscribe to this podcast, ADHD Self-Mastery, for more customized solutions for your unique brain.
Learn more about Bonnie and her Productivity Pathfinder training program for ADHD adults at thrivewithadd.com.